Hey Startup Nation, I am so glad you came back to join us for another edition of the Startup Life. You clearly are ready to get the tools you need to get ahead of the competition. Go ahead and give us a 5-star rating while you're here. Now, if you're looking for an ad-free experience, go ahead and sign up for our Patreon page, where you will get exclusive content and access to our digital products that we're beginning to launch. The link is there in the show notes. And if you want to ask questions directly to some of our guests, follow the Startup Life Podcast Club on Clubhouse, as some of our conversations will start to happen there. But back to the task at hand. Are you ready to level up? Of course you are. Get ready as the Startup Life Podcast begins now.
It's time to be about that life, the startup life. Here's your host, Dominic Lawson.
All right, Startup Nation. So I hope you're ready to receive some value today. My name is Dominic Lawson, and this is the Startup Life, the show for entrepreneurs and career-minded professionals. You know, Startup Nation, we hear stories all the time about, startup founders, billionaire founders, unicorn founders, and stuff like that. But what if I told you our guest today knows not just the stories, but the data that backs up those stories? Well, like I said, we have a fantastic guest for you today, Startup Nation. He is a partner at Data Collective, a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley with over $2 billion under management and investments in more than $10 billion startups. And he's also the author of Super Founders, What Data Reveals About Billion-Dollar Startups. He is Ali Tamaseb. Ali, how's it going, good sir?
All good. Can't complain.
All righty. Thank you. So I'm good. I can't complain, brother. I'm living a dream. Can't complain.
Awesome.
So I really appreciate your time today for coming on the Startup Life. You wrote this amazing book. And Startup Nation, if you want to purchase that book, we have a link there in the show notes for easy access. If you listen to the replay on the podcast, that book is available today. But before I kind of start into the book, man, you have a lot of valuable information in there. Are you just like because you have like a very large data set when it comes to this book, are you just a data person, or was it the content that you wrote in your book so fascinating that it kind of made you go into the data a little bit more? Kind of talk about that a little bit.
For sure. No, I am a data person. I'm a data nerd. I
was
a researcher before. I was, an academic before, kind of becoming an entrepreneur and jumping on the venture capital side of the, the dark side of the startup ecosystem, as they say.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I was a researcher. I collected data. I published papers, went on conferences, talked in journals. So I was that person, and kind of continued that thinking. And when I was a founder and when I was a VC, I kept hearing about all these things that people say about what makes for a successful entrepreneur, what makes for a successful company.
Right.
And I realized people are talking without any backing. People are just talking from their experiences. And the academic in me was like, how can you claim that without having any references? So it definitely bothered me, just hearing all these things about, you need to be of this certain age, you need to be technical, you need to be, you need to have one technical, and you need to have one business savvy. And there's all these stories, the Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak,
right?
The two co-founder duo. There's all these things, and we've seen the stories, and it's partly on media because, media thinks this is the story, or the famous one, you need to be solving a personal problem. And when media interviews, they try to go deep and say, hey, when you were 12 years old, you had this problem of you couldn't store things in your closet, and that's why you started a cloud storage company. Like, what the hell?
Right.
Don't just like try to connect things together. So yeah, I started collecting this data of it's 30,000 data points on all the billion-dollar companies that's ever started, not ever, in the past 15 years in the US. And I also collected the same data on every startup that's been founded in the US and raised a little bit of funding to have a baseline. So I compared, what these billion-dollar startups look like and what these kind of random average startup look like, and how they compared and contrasted. And so the data, like this data doesn't exist. You can't just Google or find this, data somewhere, or download it or buy it, or even ask somebody to do it or automate it. It had to be done manually. There's a lot of judgment that goes into it. There's a lot of, cold emailing and asking people and, doing research. So it took me 4 years to collect these 30,000 data points, kind of all my weekends and evenings. It was a massive data collection project.
Gotcha. No, I can definitely see that. And that's why, I wanted to bring you on the show. And Startup Nation, once again, that book is Super Founders, which is why, you don't like Ali said, you can't go and just Google this stuff. All this stuff has been jam packed in this wonderful book that he wrote. And the reason I wanted to bring you on, because like we hear those stories in the media and stuff like that. And a lot of times those stories can be a bit intimidating and even lead to people not even starting with their idea and stuff like that. And you tackle a lot of those, those kind of notions and stuff like that. One of those I want to talk about now is, the myths about, a founder's education, if you will. You have a piece in the book that says, quote, more CEOs hold advanced degrees than drop out of a bachelor's program, but neither status increases or decreases chances of success, period. Because we hear those stories all the time. Like, they dropped out of, their sophomore year or of MIT or something like that. Kind of talk about the education piece, if you don't mind, Ali.
For sure. I think, even today, even in 2021, you go and look in TechCrunch and stuff, and many of these titles of these articles start with, this university dropout founders, blah, blah, is starting this company. And like, why does it matter? Right? Why do you put that in the title? Talk about what the company is doing. And, it's partly because of, Zuckerberg and Bill Gates. There is definitely these, tech, super young, 19-year-old, Harvard dropouts, right? And they've been turned into movies, and they've been kind of turned into the pop culture.
Right.
But when you look into the data, that's less than 3% of all billion-dollar startups that gets founded. Those kind of dropout, super good university, or Harvard dropouts, Stanford dropouts. That's less than 3%. Everything else is, I wouldn't say normal people. They're super accomplished people. But it doesn't follow that stereotype. There we have, people with MBAs. There's a lot of things that goes behind, don't invest in MBAs. MBAs are just like crunching numbers. They don't know how to run a company. Turns out more than 22% of all billion-dollar startups are started by MBAs. Or people say, don't invest in PhDs. PhDs have focused on one thing in their life. They don't know anything about management. They don't know anything about, how to start a company. Turns out there's more PhDs than dropouts. Same thing for, lawyers. Don't invest in lawyers because blah, blah. Don't invest in doctors because blah, blah, blah. Or do invest in any of these cases. So basically what the data showed was, there's all these, cases of, what percentage were PhDs, what percentage were lawyers, what percentage were just bachelors, what percentages were dropouts, what percentages were like high school people. There's all these people. But when you can compare that with those kind of random group of startups that also get funded and founded and funded, there's no difference. So if you are a PhD, you're not less or more likely. If you're a dropout, you're not less or more likely. If you are a lawyer, you're not less or more likely. Right. Comparing this with the general population, obviously these people are more educated, right? Obviously these people have more advanced degrees. Obviously they've gone to better schools. That's all true. But when you compare people who get funding with people who become billion-dollar company founders, it seems like education alone, or what you studied, or what level of education you had, that doesn't change your chance.
Right. And you definitely drive that point home as well. And, a lot of times, I kind of want to transition to this next point because, again, it's not like you're debunking myths or whatever, but kind of like definitely challenging the quote unquote, what we think may be conventional wisdom when we hear these stories like that. Cause it always seems like, the story goes, idea, video montage, and then success. Right. But there's a lot that happens within that quote unquote, video montage, if you will. And one of those you kind of talk about in your book, is pivoting. I want to read something here really quickly as well. Quote, pivots are extremely common in the startup community, generally welcomes them. Many of the companies that have eventually seen billion-dollar valuations started with a completely different idea, end quote. And so a lot of times we think that people are just like, they were just stubborn about this idea and they just kind of trudged forward. But, you talk about here that pivots happen very often. Can you talk about that a little bit more, Ali?
For sure. So I think that this is in a chapter that I'm talking about the origin idea.
Right.
And this is the other myth that people think, you need to be solving your own personal problem. And that's cool, and it seems fine and seems fair, and it's good if you have a personal problem to solve. But that might be the reason we see so many delivery apps or parking apps and these kind of stuff. And there's so many massive $1 trillion problems in the world that gets unsolved because it's not anyone's personal problem.
Right.
Anywhere from climate change to agriculture to new material to chemicals, everything like that. So in that chapter, I talk about, what doesn't get talked about is many of these billion-dollar founders, they actually spent a year, in some cases 2 years, kind of just changing that idea, listening to the market, talking to advisors, talking to people, starting from an assumption and invalidating that assumption, moving on to the next idea. And it's that reception to hear the feedback from the market and be passionate about what you're doing and, not be emotionally attached to a specific idea because, what you think it is. So yeah, basically these stories of how these founders of billion-dollar startups went through, changes of ideas and how many of these companies were not what we ended up looking at is fascinating. Brex, for example, it's a financial technology company. They built credit cards for startups.
Right.
It was a VR thing. Like they applied to Y Combinator, these two founders, to build like a VR virtual reality headset kind of company. And midway they thought of like, we don't know what we're doing. We're not making any progress. Let's do something else, right? And they built Brex, and that's a $1 billion company. YouTube. Do you know what YouTube was early on? It's kind of funny.
What's that?
These founders thought video is coming up. Video is super interesting. Let's build something for dating so people can record themselves and what they want to do and put it on like as a video. And people weren't comfortable back in that time to share videos about their personally kind of pitching themselves. So they put like cat videos and videos from their travels and stuff. And that kind of, the founder said, okay, maybe that's fair. Let people do whatever they want to.
Right.
And that thing became YouTube. There's so many of these things, Shopify, where that started, a bunch of other startups, they've all been kind of gone through pivots. PayPal, there's so many, famous stories, and they're not even, pivots, small pivots. Some of them are massive pivots. Let me think about that. Like, even like PayPal, that was a very different thing. That was like a mobile emulator thing for security. And that thing became, mobile payments and, peer-to-peer payments and PayPal.
Right. Right. No, that pivot part is so important. I wanted to talk about that because, again, like I said, we see too many times where people just think you have to just be bullheaded about your idea and just kind of push it forward. And sometimes, you have to listen. And you talked about this earlier, and I appreciate that, where you talked about, listening to, having your assumption and then listening to the marketplace, listening to mentors, Startup Nation, listening to people who may not even necessarily do what you do, but have an idea of what you're trying to do. For sure. I want to go back to something you was talking about earlier, as far as like people being in, accelerators and Y Combinator and stuff like that. In your book, you talk about how, like, I think you said less than 15% go through an accelerator program. And a lot of times we think that, like, that's kind of the road to success. Kind of talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I think, there's all these investors and there's all these entrepreneurs who think, that the path is, an accelerator program or multiple accelerator programs, and then, you hit it big. And it's not that it's not true, but that's a small part of the reality.
Right.
So yes, it helps you. If you get into Y Combinator, it actually makes you more likely,
right,
to raise funding. It does make you more likely to become a $1 billion company. But less than 15% of all $1 billion startups ever have gone through Y Combinator or any other accelerator program for that. And in many cases, the reason is these are like second-time founders. They've sold companies before. They have a super strong team. They don't need accelerator programs. They don't need incubator programs. They already know what they do. They know that they have their connections. So yes, if you are a first-time entrepreneur, and if that helps you, right, it's a good start, and going through these programs is good. But just keep that in mind, that's a very small part of the reality, and there's so many other people who build billion-dollar startups that don't go through any of these programs.
Absolutely. And I believe you talked about Yeti, the chiller company, like, I can't even think what they're called now, but like you put drinks in and stuff like that, right? You talked about that in your book, but also off the beaten path of a little bit when it comes to whether it be accelerator or incubator, is that, like, I was talking to a friend a few weeks ago, right? And he was saying, like, he has a tech idea and stuff like this. Like, I got to move to San Francisco. Got to get this to the Valley, right? And I was telling him, like, look, man, like, I get it. I get why you want to be there. That's why a lot of success happens. But, man, like, all over the country, man, like these startup communities and for funding and ideas and even accelerators are popping up all over the country, man. And you talk about that in your book as well. I want to read this quote really quickly. States like Florida, Texas, Washington, and Utah were also home to several billion-dollar companies each. Epic, you talk about Epic in North Carolina, Chewy in Florida, Qualtrics in Utah, especially Utah. I've been fascinated with Utah, the startup community for a while now, but kind of talk about those other kind of off Silicon Valley places where people are finding success, Ali.
For sure. And I have an interview. So one interesting thing about this book is each chapter has an interview.
Sure.
And when I talk about this data, there's an interview. So I have an interview with Rachel Carlson, who is the co-founder and CEO of Guild Education, that company is in Denver. What is interesting, and that's a multi-billion-dollar company. What they do is they sell these kind of educational training and educational courses and upskilling to employers,
right? Like
employers of Starbucks and these kind of companies. What's interesting is she wasn't a Stanford MBA. She was living in Silicon Valley, and her co-founder was living in Silicon Valley. They and the company was in Silicon Valley for the first, I think, year and a half. And then they made this decision to move out and to go to Denver and start a company there. And the story and the reason why is fascinating. So they need a bunch of, so they have the tech team and they have the engineers, but they also need operational people who would kind of work with these students.
Right.
Going. So many startups have this kind of service layer that there are people who do the job. If it's like Stitch Fix, there's like, the stylist. If there's Uber, there's drivers.
Mm-hmm.
So for this company, and her vision was, I don't want to separate the engineering team and like the finance team from these people who are actually doing the work. I want everybody to be in the same place. And we can afford to do that in San Francisco, but we can afford to do that in Denver. So in order for everyone to be together in one office, and for everyone to understand what the problem is the other teams are facing, let's start the company somewhere that everybody can afford a home, everybody can afford a living.
Right.
And that's why they moved to Denver. It turned out to be a good decision for them. So in the book, I talk about you don't have to be in Silicon Valley, and there's I think about half of these billion-dollar companies are built outside Silicon Valley and other kind of tech hubs in New York and Boston, and many of these stereotypes about what company gets built where is also not necessarily correct. So you would think, look, Boston is biotech. There's actually a bunch of software unicorn startups there. Or you would think New York, that would be like fintech, but actually there's a bunch of software infrastructure companies or healthcare companies built in New York. There's actually more software and infrastructure unicorns than fintech unicorns in New York City. So a bunch of these stereotypes. I'm not saying you shouldn't come to Silicon Valley. I would probably still suggest that, and I know it's it's a distributed world and everybody can work from anywhere. So it's a very evolving situation. So I wouldn't say don't come if this is the place you think you want to live and this is the best place you have connections, come for it. But the data, the book and the data is talking about there's all these billion-dollar companies that gets built in other places too.
For sure. No, I definitely appreciate that, and I appreciate the nuance in that response as well. Once again, Startup Nation, we're talking to Ali Tamaseb, the author of Super Founders: What Data Reveals About Billion-Dollar Startups. And if you want to get this book, Startup Nation, that link is there in the show notes if you're listening to the replay on the podcast. And if you're listening on radio, you can just whatever you get your favorite books from as you on your path of entrepreneurship, for sure. I want to ask you something really quick, Ali, because in the book you talk about bootstrapping versus VC backing versus self-financing. I guess I'm curious, from your doctrine, your standpoint, the things that you've seen in the VC world, what questions do I need to ask myself if I'm that startup founder? If I need to which route should I go? Should I go the VC route? Should I go to bootstrapping route? Or should I just self-finance this thing? Kind of talk about that a little bit.
For sure. I mean, self-finance, if anybody can self-finance, and there's very few people who have the financial backing to be able to self-finance, then, probably the right way to do it. Or a portion of their wealth that they can put in this startup. Let's talk about bootstrapping versus venture capital.
Sure.
I think a part of that is rooted in your vision and how big you think this company go. I think in the book I talk about this, for years, for hundreds of years, companies got financing from banks. They did not sell equity, they raised debt. And venture capital, the whole business of venture capital is 50-year-old. It's very, very recent in the whole business of starting companies and starting businesses. And what happened was technology companies got started. There were semiconductor companies, and banks just didn't understand. It used to be that you build a railway and the bank would understand, okay, if I invest $1 million here, you would start this rail system, you will charge customers this much, and I will get the money back. Mm-hmm. But these technology companies kind of started brewing up, and the banks didn't understand them, and that's where kind of venture capital kind of got created. There was a lot of push from the Cold War and the government, a lot of financing that went through that, a lot of good programs, governmental programs that went through starting the venture capital concept. But that's kind of, venture capital is reserved for venture. So if what you're doing, if the type of business that you're doing is venturing out for something that's super, super risky, and you would not be able to do it without venture, and you're putting yourself at the place that, okay, this may work, 1 in 100 times, 1% chance, 2% chance, and the other 98% it will lose. If you're prepared for that, I may build a $5 billion company, and that's like a 1% chance, and this specific problem has that much, potential, then, venture capital is a wrap. For a lot of people, they have amazing ideas, and that might be a $20 million a year revenue company. And that's amazing. If you own 100% of that business and you have a 60% chance of actually getting there, that's probably a lot better than, a 1% chance of a $1 billion company that you will own 10% of, because, VCs take the rest. So I think a lot more founders should be more intentional about, what type of business do I want to start? Do I want to own 100% of this thing? And do I want to have a 50% chance? Venture capital is reserved for super risky. I want to, go big or go home, go big or like literally fail, lose all my savings, lose 5 years of my life. And, on the other hand, I may get rewarded with a, $100 million, $500 million, $1 billion outcome.
Right. Right. For sure. For sure.
And it turns out more than 90% of these $1 billion companies are venture backed. And, that's not to say venture capital is good. It's just, these are different types of companies. And there's, probably 10,000 more companies that are, worth $100 million, and they're non-venture backed, and they're super awesome for the founder, and their founders are more wealthy.
For sure. I want to ask a follow-up question to that, because we recently had Jay Byrne Murphy on the show. He's an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur who built quite a few businesses in Europe and stuff like that. And we asked him about, funding for businesses, venture backing and stuff like that. And we asked him with the caveat of COVID and the perception of maybe it's not as much money out there and stuff like that. He says there absolutely is like there's definitely a lot of different funding opportunities for venture back or whatever the case may be. What's your perspective on that? Is there money just out there flowing for good ideas still, even during a pandemic?
Yeah. So I think in the book I have this chapter about recessions and kind of the low times in the startup community that I talk. The data shows the activity kind of goes down by about 25 to 30% when something like 2000 or 2008 happens.
Right.
Valuations for later stage companies take a much bigger hit, maybe more closer to 45 to 50%. So basically the valuation gets dropped by half. When it's like a 2000 or 2008. And you would see that with Facebook. Facebook had raised like super late stage Series D or something like that at an $8 billion valuation or $5 billion valuation. And, after a couple of years, they had to raise the next round and they had grown so much bigger. But it was it was a financial crisis. So they had to take, a haircut. And it's funny, but they raised on a, $10 billion valuation, which is great, but it wasn't where they wanted to be. So this is the kind of companies that get a cut, that the later stage companies get more hit. The earlier stages companies get a little bit less hit. During this pandemic, during those first couple months, as people were just in a shock, this kind of idea of investing from remote or from Zoom or video calls weren't there. So for about 3 months, there was like a halt and activity went down. But then you actually saw it coming back up. And I think in the past 6 months, what I'm seeing is there's a lot more activity. I don't have a specific data on that, but It just feels like there's more money, there's more startups, there's more good quality people, and there's more funding. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is there's been some people who had the time, they were at home, and they could think about, okay, maybe actually right now is the time for me to quit my job and go and start that company. So there's more founders, there's more quality founders starting companies because they got the chance to think and kind of relax and finally get it done and hit the start. And there's more money. I mean, there's a lot more money in venture capital and in the hands of investors today than it was last year and 5 years ago and definitely 10 years ago. There's like order of magnitude different levels of money. And part of it is because capital is cheap now because of the interest rates. And, venture capital is risky, but the reward that you can get is a lot more. So there's more money in the hands of investors and there's more quality founders. So basically, yes, the market is more crazy. There's more founders. There's higher valuations as well.
I hear that. Thank you for sharing that because what I don't want to have happen is people kind of pump the brakes a little bit just because they feel like the perception is not necessarily what the reality is. So I definitely appreciate that. Once again, Startup Nation, we're actually wrapping up with Ali Tamaseb, the author of, give me just a second, Super Founders, What Data Reveals About Billion-Dollar Startups. And if you want to get that book, Startup Nation, we have a link there in the show notes for easy access if you listen to the replay on the podcast. And if you're listening to radio, just wherever you get your favorite books. So I want to ask you this because one of the things you talk about often is being a tinkerer. Why is that important for the entrepreneur, Ali?
Being a what?
A tinkerer, like people who just kind of tinker around with stuff, right?
Right. Yes. So that's the concept of the kind of super founder. And the idea is your hustle and your ability to start companies and get them to finish line is more important than a shiny resume. So when I look into investing, I look into people who have started companies before and got them to somewhere. It doesn't need to be a massive success. If you have found, $1 billion company before, you probably don't need money for your next company. But, smaller successes, smaller outcomes, a project that you got to a certain scale. And when you look into these founders of billion-dollar startups, you definitely see that pattern, that these people, started a company and they sold it for $12 million before. And before that, they started a company and that failed. And before that, they had started, a nonprofit project while in college. And before that, they had started this kind of, online business selling, cards or gift cards or something like that. Mm-hmm. These are the people who tinker with ideas, start clubs, start projects, start selling things online, start companies, start projects. And basically the gist of the book is, like everything, practice makes perfect.
Right. And
that applies to entrepreneurship as well. A lot of people think these are super genius people who got lucky, came up with a brilliant idea. That happened. Next year, they were a billionaire. And that's That's basically not it. That doesn't happen. Even people who we think are first-time entrepreneurs, even the Mark Zuckerberg who founded Facebook at 19, he started this app who looked like Spotify back in, I think, 1999 when he was 17 years old, and Microsoft wanted to buy that. And you go before that, or you go after that, what the projects he started in college. So even people who are like super young or first-time entrepreneurs, you see that they've done these things before. You see that they've tinkered, they've started companies, they've started projects, and eventually they learn and they see the progress and they see that kind of flywheel rotate once, and they can kind of turn it more and more and finally get to these kind of billion-dollar outcomes.
For sure. No, I appreciate you sharing that because, and I'm kind of reminded of a quote by Mark Benioff. I'm going to screw it up, but it was some along the lines of like, I'm not necessarily the smartest person in my company. That's why I hired 20 MBAs. And so I'm glad you said the part about like people think that like, these people like super smart people, not that they're not smart at all, but like they're like, you got a 200 IQ or something like that. You know what I mean? Or they got lucky and stuff like that. Is that a lot of people that are out here making those moves in entrepreneurship are definitely just people who are just kind of willing to bet on themselves and stuff like that. But also with a little bit of smarts as well about particular things. So I appreciate you sharing that. Ali, I want to ask you one last question before I let you go. Again, I appreciate the time you've share with us today on the show. And once again, Startup Nation, that book is Super Founders, What Data Reveals About Billion-Dollar Startups. It features interviews from firsthand accounts and stories about Tony Fadell, founder of Nest, Peter Thiel and stuff like that, Eric Yuan of Zoom, stuff like that, and many others. So make sure you add that to your entrepreneurial toolkit. So Ali, I just want to ask you this, man, because look, you're in the VC world and stuff like that. And I think a lot of times startup founders think that the only value that a venture capitalist has is just the checkbook, right? But a venture capitalist has so much more value than just a checkbook, like a network, advice, stuff like that. Kind of share that part of the VC world, if you don't mind, Ali.
For sure. I think things are changing.
Okay.
They're towards what you're saying.
Sure.
So it might have been just a check, back in the day.
Right.
But now there's so much more money and there's so many more VCs that there is competition.
Fair enough.
VCs. And it's good to have competition. So when there's competition, you need to layer in services. So we have talent partners who help find talent. We have PR people who help you get PR. And, obviously we have the network. I personally believe the biggest value add a venture capitalist has is their network. They've done it for a longer time. They've done it across companies. They've seen people. It's our job to network with super successful people who you can sell to, people who can join your board, people who you can hire. That's our job. So if you select for the right venture capitalist, other than the check, you will get access to their network. And basically, I think you should be checking for the network, and you should be receiving money, accepting money from people who would give you access to the largest, and it's not just largest, someone who has, 20,000 connections on LinkedIn, that doesn't matter. If you have 50 super awesome people in your Rolodex that you can come and bring to the table, that's valuable. Right. And that's what the best VCs do.
For sure. Now, 50 people in a Rolodex that you can do something with it extremely valuable, Startup Nation. So I appreciate you saying that, Ali. Once again, Startup Nation, that's our time with Ali Tamaseb, the author of Super Founders, What Data Reveals About Billion-Dollar Startups. Thank you so much, Ali.
For sure. Thank you. I was glad to be here.
No worries. And as always, Startup Nation, if you have an idea, be about that life, the startup life. If you want to let us know what you think about the show, have an idea for a show topic, or would like to advertise on a show, send us a message. Our contact information is there in the show notes, or feel free to reach out to us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Go ahead and follow us while you're at it. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast One, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, and be sure to hit us with that 5-star rating. We would really appreciate that. Be sure to check out the show's website and its startup blog, where either I or some of the world's best business minds share content that will give you the the edge you need in your journey, whether that's the path of entrepreneurship or climbing the corporate ladder. Subscribe to our Patreon to listen to ad-free episodes, exclusive content, and digital products that we are beginning to offer. And if you want to be part of the conversation, join the Startup Life podcast on Clubhouse to have the ability to talk directly to some of our guests. And as always, Startup Nation, if you have an idea, be about that life, the startup life.